What happens when a cocky judge underestimates a 17-year-old detective in the middle of a high-stakes murder trial? Laughter turns to gasps as this fearless teen pieces together the truth right in front of the entire courtroom, leaving everyone, including the judge, speechless. You won't believe how she uncovers the shocking twist that changes everything. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the case began, the air thick with tension and skepticism. The defendant, Daniel Carter, sat hunched at the defense table, his hands gripping the edge of his chair as though it might keep him from falling into the abyss. He was a man of modest means, calloused hands, a faded jacket, and eyes that looked haunted. Beside him, his defense attorney fidgeted with a pen, glancing nervously at the stack of papers before him. Across the room, the prosecutor exuded confidence, their voice sharp and commanding as they outlined the damning evidence that painted Daniel as a cold-blooded murderer. Judge Eleanor Grant surveyed the courtroom with her usual air of indifference. Her sharp, angular features mirrored the icy tone of her voice as she leaned forward. "Let's keep this trial moving, shall we?" "The evidence speaks for itself," she said, her gavel tapping lightly against the desk. Judge Grant was infamous for her brisk manner and piercing words, qualities that had earned her respect and fear in equal measure. To her, this was just another open and shut case, one that would undoubtedly end with a guilty verdict. Then, almost as an afterthought, the defense attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, his voice lacking conviction, "we'd like to introduce a consultant to assist in reviewing the evidence. A specialist." Judge Grant arched an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint, skeptical smirk. "A specialist? For a case like this? By all means, enlighten us." The courtroom door creaked open, and in walked Cassie Blake. She was 17, though her petite frame and slightly unkempt hair made her seem even younger. She clutched a battered notebook under one arm, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as she approached the defense table. Whispers rippled through the room, and someone in the back snickered. Cassie ignored them, her eyes darting around the room as she mentally cataloged every detail. The polished brass nameplate on Judge Grant's desk, the faint scuff marks on the prosecutor's shoe, the overly pristine condition of the evidence folder on the table. Judge Grant didn't bother to hide her amusement. "You're kidding," she said, leaning back in her chair. "This is your specialist? Do they even let you drive yet? Let alone analyze evidence?" Cassie stopped beside the defense table, her posture stiff but her gaze steady. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Age doesn't determine whether someone sees the details others miss." The judge chuckled, a low sound that seemed to echo in the silence. "We'll see about that. But I'm warning you, Miss Blake, Cassie Blake," she replied, standing a little taller. "Miss Blake," the judge continued, "this isn't a game. If you waste this court's time, you'll regret it." Cassie nodded once, her fingers tightening around her notebook. "Understood, Your Honor." The trial resumed, the prosecutor presenting a timeline of the events that led to the murder. Daniel Carter, they argued, had been seen leaving the scene moments after the crime. The murder weapon, a wrench, bore his fingerprints, and surveillance footage placed him at the victim's apartment an hour before the incident. It was a narrative tied up in a neat, damning bow. Cassie scribbled furiously in her notebook, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen the footage earlier, studied it frame by frame, and something about it gnawed at her. The timestamp, a tiny detail most wouldn't notice, didn't align with the shadows on the wall in the background. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her question its validity. As the prosecutor wrapped up their opening argument, Cassie leaned toward her mentor, Detective Marcus Reed, who sat quietly at the defense table. He was a grizzled man with a worn leather jacket and a permanent scowl, a relic of a past spent chasing criminals before his retirement. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The timestamp on the footage, it doesn't match the angle of the shadows. Something's off." Marcus glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "You sure?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Positive, she replied, her eyes flicking to the evidence table. And that wrench, it looks too clean, like it's been wiped down except for his prints. Before Marcus could respond, Judge Grant's voice cut through the courtroom. Miss Blake, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Since you're so intent on solving this case, why don't you share your brilliant observations with the court? Cassie stood, her heart pounding, but her face calm. Your Honor, she began, meeting the judge's icy gaze. The timestamp on the surveillance footage doesn't match the natural light in the background. The footage has been edited. A ripple of shock spread through the room. Judge Grant's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of curiosity she quickly masked. And what exactly are you suggesting? She asked, her voice cold. That someone tampered with the evidence, Cassie said, her voice steady. And if I can prove it, this trial isn't as open and shut as it seems. The courtroom grew silent, the weight of Cassie's words hanging in the air. The prosecutor straightened their papers, clearly irritated by the interruption. Judge Grant, however, didn't look away from Cassie. There was something in the girl's unwavering confidence that made the judge pause, a rarity for someone as jaded as she was. Tampered evidence, the judge repeated, leaning forward slightly. Her tone was clipped, yet there was a trace of intrigue buried beneath it. You're accusing someone of altering the surveillance footage? A bold claim, Miss Blake? Care to elaborate? Cassie swallowed hard, her mind racing. The shadows on the wall in the footage, she began, keeping her voice even, don't match the time of day listed on the timestamp. At that angle, the sun would have been lower in the sky, meaning the footage was likely recorded earlier, or the timestamp was altered. The prosecutor scoffed, stepping forward. Your Honor, this is preposterous. She's nitpicking over shadows. We have hard evidence, fingerprints, eyewitnesses, and a confession of guilt. Cassie's head snapped toward the prosecutor. A coerced confession, she shot back, her voice firm. And as for the fingerprints, did anyone bother to check if the wrench was wiped down first? His prints might have been placed there after the fact. The prosecutor's face darkened, but before they could respond, Judge Grant raised a hand to silence the room. Enough, she said, her tone commanding. Her sharp eyes flicked toward Cassie. You're implying a level of orchestration here, Miss Blake. If you're going to accuse someone of tampering with evidence, you'd better have something to back it up. Cassie hesitated. She knew she was treading dangerous ground, but her instincts screamed that she was right. If the court grants me access to the original footage, she said carefully, I can prove the tampering, and I'd like permission to examine the wrench under a UV light for signs of cleaning. The judge leaned back, tapping her fingers against the desk in thought. The request was bold, almost laughably so, but there was something about the conviction in Cassie's voice that made her hesitate. For the first time in years, Judge Grant felt the faintest flicker of doubt about her own certainty. Fine, the judge said at last, her voice measured. But you'll be doing so under supervision, and this court expects results, not speculation. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The defense attorney leaned toward Marcus and whispered, This better not blow up in our faces. Marcus only nodded, his expression unreadable. As the judge called for a recess, Cassie gathered her notes and stepped out of the courtroom, her legs trembling slightly now that the tension had lifted. Marcus followed her into the hallway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. You're playing a dangerous game, he muttered, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. Cassie turned to him, her expression defiant. If I don't, Daniel's going to prison for something he didn't do. Marcus studied her for a moment, then sighed heavily. You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. But guts don't win cases, proof does. You'd better hope your hunch about that footage is right. It's not a hunch, she said firmly. I've been watching people dismiss details my whole life. That's where the truth hides. Right in front of everyone who's too distracted to notice. For a brief moment, Marcus's hard expression softened. There was something about Cassie that reminded him of himself when he first started out. Young, reckless and unwilling to let go of the idea that justice was more than just a word. "All right," he said finally. "Let's get to work." Back inside the courtroom, Judge Grant sat alone, reviewing her notes. Her earlier skepticism had dulled into something more complex, an unease she couldn't quite place. She had presided over hundreds of cases, seen every kind of defendant, lawyer, and excuse imaginable. But this girl, this teenager with her scribbled notes and sharp eyes, was unlike anyone she'd encountered before. The judge shook her head, dismissing the thought. She had a trial to manage, and distractions were not part of the equation. But even as she tried to focus, the words tampered evidence lingered in her mind like an unanswered question. Cassie and Marcus made their way to the evidence room, a dimly lit space that smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The room was lined with shelves of carefully cataloged items from countless cases, each one a small puzzle in itself. A stern-looking technician met them at the door, clipboard in hand. "Judge Grant approved your request," the technician said, though her tone made it clear she didn't think much of it. "The original footage and the wrench are here. But let me be clear, you're being watched, and if you tamper with anything, you're done. Understand?" Cassie nodded, her expression calm. "I wouldn't dream of it." The technician handed her a laptop containing the original footage and pulled out a plastic evidence bag holding the wrench. Marcus folded his arms, watching as Cassie got to work. She opened her notebook and began cross-referencing timestamps, her fingers flying over the laptop keyboard. Occasionally, she muttered something under her breath, but her focus remained unbroken. Marcus leaned closer. "What are you looking for?" "The light," Cassie replied without looking up. "It's all about the light. Shadows can't lie, Marcus. The sun moves in a predictable pattern, and if this timestamp is wrong, the shadows will prove it." She paused the footage on a frame where the shadow of a lamppost stretched across the sidewalk. Pulling a ruler from her bag, she measured the angle of the shadow on the screen. Then she flipped through her notebook to a chart she'd created. "This frame," she said, tapping the screen, "claims it was recorded at 5:47 p.m., but at that time the sun would have been lower and the shadow would have stretched further east. This footage wasn't recorded when they said it was." Marcus blinked, impressed despite himself. "And the wrench?" Cassie grabbed the evidence bag, holding it under the UV light the technician had begrudgingly provided. Slowly, faint streaks began to appear on the surface of the metal, traces of a cleaning solution. Cassie pointed at them triumphantly. "There," she said. "Someone wiped this down, but they didn't clean it evenly. The smudges are still visible." The technician frowned, leaning in to inspect the wrench. "I'll have to verify this with a chemical test," she said begrudgingly, but even she couldn't hide her surprise. Cassie turned to Marcus, her eyes shining with determination. "This isn't just sloppy evidence collection," she said. "Someone's trying to frame Daniel." Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "If you're right, this goes deeper than we thought. But we're going to need more than shadows and smudges to prove it." When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The prosecutor glanced at them with thinly veiled disdain, clearly eager to dismantle whatever Cassie had found. Judge Grant called the room to order, her gavel striking the desk with its usual authority. "Well," the judge said, her sharp eyes locking onto Cassie. "Do you have anything worth the court's time, or are we all just indulging a teenager's fantasy here?" Cassie took a deep breath and stepped forward, holding her notebook in one hand and the evidence bag in the other. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "I've reviewed the surveillance footage and examined the wrench. Both have been tampered with." A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Judge Grant raised an eyebrow but gestured for her to continue. "The shadows in the footage don't align with the timestamp," Cassie explained. "The footage was either recorded earlier than claimed or edited later. And the wrench, while it does have Daniel Carter's fingerprints, shows clear signs of having been cleaned with a chemical solution. Someone went out of their way to make it look like the weapon was only handled by him." The prosecutor stood abruptly, their face flushed. "Your Honor, this is pure conjecture. She's basing her argument on shadows and smudges. This is hardly conclusive evidence." Judge Grant held up a hand, silencing the prosecutor. Her gaze remained fixed on Cassie, scrutinizing her like a hawk assessing its prey. "And what do you propose we do with this information, Miss Blake?" she asked coolly. Cassie met the judge's eyes, refusing to be intimidated. "I propose we subpoena the source of the surveillance footage and the original custodian of the wrench," she said. "If we trace the chain of custody, we can find out who tampered with them, and why." The judge leaned back, tapping her fingers against the desk in thought. She hated to admit it, but there was a logic to the girl's argument. After a long pause, she spoke. "Very well," Judge Grant said. "The court will subpoena the relevant parties. But be warned, Miss Blake. If this leads nowhere, you'll have wasted everyone's time, and I don't take kindly to that." Cassie nodded, her heart pounding. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, half of them waiting for her to fail. But she didn't care. She was one step closer to the truth, and she wasn't about to stop now. As she returned to her seat, Marcus leaned in and whispered, "You've got guts, kid. Let's hope you've got luck, too." Cassie gave him a small, determined smile. "Luck's got nothing to do with it," she whispered back. The courtroom emptied for the afternoon recess, leaving Cassie and Marcus with a brief moment to regroup. Cassie sat on one of the benches in the corridor, her notebook open on her lap, flipping through the pages with a furrowed brow. Marcus leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed, watching her silently. "This whole thing stinks," Marcus muttered after a while. "Tampered evidence, coerced confessions. Someone's going to a lot of trouble to bury the truth. You sure you're ready for what happens if we kick the hornet's nest?" Cassie paused, her pen hovering above the page. "If I don't, who will?" she replied, her voice tinged with frustration. "No one believed Daniel from the start because he doesn't look like someone worth defending. But I've seen this before. People like him are easy targets." Marcus studied her for a moment, noting the fire in her eyes. "This isn't about just this case, is it?" he asked quietly. Cassie didn't answer immediately. She closed her notebook and stared down at it, the edges of the pages dog-eared from use. "When I was 10, she began softly, "my neighbor, Mr. Russo, was arrested for stealing from the hardware store. Everyone in the neighborhood swore he did it, but I knew him. He used to help me with my math homework, always had his toolbox ready to fix a broken door or leaky faucet for free. He wasn't a thief." She glanced up at Marcus, her expression hardening. "I proved he didn't do it. Found the real thief in a security tape the police didn't bother to check. But by the time Mr. Russo was cleared, he'd lost his job, his house, everything. People like Daniel, they don't stand a chance unless someone fights for them." Marcus didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, his respect for the girl deepening. "All right, kid," he said finally. "Let's find out who's pulling the strings." Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor was pacing near their table, fuming as they flipped through a stack of papers. Judge Grant's decision to subpoena further evidence was a blow to their airtight narrative, and they weren't about to let some teenager derail their case. Cassie noticed the prosecutor's agitation as she and Marcus re-entered the room. It was a subtle sign, but it told her one thing: they were scared. Scared that she might actually uncover something they couldn't explain away. When court resumed, the subpoenas were issued, and the judge called a recess until the next day to allow time for the requested materials to be delivered. As the courtroom emptied, Cassie felt a flicker of triumph, but knew better than to celebrate. There were still too many questions unanswered. That evening, Cassie sat in her cluttered bedroom, surrounded by crime scene photos, handwritten notes, and open books on forensic analysis. She traced a finger over the timeline she'd sketched out on a large piece of paper pinned to her wall. Something still didn't add up. If the evidence had been planted, then the real killer had to have had access to both the crime scene and the surveillance footage. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Marcus. "You're not going to like this," he said the moment she answered. "What happened?" she asked, already sensing trouble. "The subpoena for the footage custodian came back empty," he said grimly. Apparently the guy retired a month ago and left no forwarding address. Convenient, huh? Cassie frowned, gripping the phone tighter. And the wrench? They're running the chemical test, but we won't have results until tomorrow. Cassie exhaled slowly, trying to process the setback. Someone's covering their tracks, she said. They're one step ahead of us. Yeah, Marcus replied, his tone low. And that means they know we're getting close. The next morning, the courtroom was tense as the trial resumed. The prosecution was clearly eager to regain control, presenting another witness who claimed to have seen Daniel leaving the scene. Cassie listened carefully, taking note of every word. Something about the witness's story felt rehearsed, too polished, too perfect. As the witness finished their testimony, Cassie leaned toward Marcus. That guy's lying, she whispered. How can you tell? Marcus asked. His details don't match the police report, she said. In the report, he said he was parked across the street. Just now, he said he was standing on the corner. Which is it? Before Marcus could respond, the defense attorney stood to cross-examine the witness. Cassie slid a note across the table to him, and he glanced at it briefly before addressing the witness. Mr. Adams, the attorney began, you testified that you were standing on the corner when you saw my client leave the building. Is that correct? Yes, the witness replied, shifting slightly in his seat. And yet, the attorney continued, holding up the police report, you told officers on the scene that you were parked across the street at the time. Can you explain the discrepancy? The witness faltered, his confidence visibly shaken. I meant I parked across the street and then walked to the corner, he stammered. Cassie narrowed her eyes, sensing the cracks in his story. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as the witness stammered under the weight of his contradiction. Judge Grant, who had been sitting back in her chair with an air of detached authority, suddenly leaned forward. Her sharp gaze pierced through the witness like a blade. Mr. Adams, the judge said, her voice cutting through the tension like glass. This court expects clarity and accuracy in your testimony. I'll ask you again. Were you parked across the street or were you standing on the corner? Which is it? The witness hesitated, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He looked to the prosecutor for help, but they offered nothing more than a subtle shake of the head, signaling he was on his own. I parked across the street, Adams finally muttered. I guess I misspoke earlier. Cassie's lips curved into a small, triumphant smirk. She had rattled him, and it was clear to everyone in the room that his testimony was now in question. Marcus leaned over to her, his voice barely above a whisper. Nice catch, he said, a glimmer of approval in his tone. Judge Grant wasn't finished. Miss Blake, she said suddenly, directing her attention to Cassie. Since you've made a habit of injecting yourself into these proceedings, do you have any additional observations about this witness's testimony? The question caught Cassie off guard. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a barely perceptible nod. Rising slowly, she faced the judge and cleared her throat. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The witness's story doesn't just have one discrepancy. There's another issue. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but masking it with her usual skepticism. Go on. Cassie took a step forward, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. Mr. Adams claimed to have seen Daniel Carter leaving the scene at approximately 6:15 p.m., but according to the police timeline, the crime was reported at 6:20 p.m., only 5 minutes later. That's not enough time for him to have left the scene, walked to wherever he was parked, and called the police. The timing doesn't add up. A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom as Cassie's words sank in. Judge Grant narrowed her eyes at the prosecutor. Care to address this inconsistency? She asked pointedly. The prosecutor rose, clearly scrambling for a response. Your Honor, with all due respect, Miss Blake's analysis is speculative. Timelines can be imprecise, especially in high-stress situations. People don't always remember exact details. Cassie didn't back down. It's not speculation, she countered. It's a pattern. Every time this case gets too close to the truth, something doesn't line up. And it's not just mistakes, it's intentional. Judge Grant leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she regarded Cassie with a mix of annoyance and grudging respect. "Miss Blake," she said, her tone measured, "you seem to have a theory forming. Care to share it with the court?" Cassie hesitated for a brief moment, weighing her next words carefully. "Your Honor," she began, "I believe Mr. Adams was coached. His testimony wasn't just rehearsed. It was fabricated to corroborate the tampered evidence. Whoever is behind this wants Daniel Carter to take the fall, and they're willing to manipulate witnesses and evidence to make it happen." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Marcus, who had seen his fair share of courtroom drama, looked slightly stunned by the boldness of her statement. The prosecutor's face turned red with indignation. "This is outrageous!" they shouted, slamming a hand on their table. "This so-called consultant is making baseless accusations without a shred of proof. Your Honor, I move to have her barred from further participation in this trial." Judge Grant raised a hand to silence the outburst. "Enough," she said firmly. Turning her attention back to Cassie, she added, "Miss Blake, while I admire your tenacity, this court deals in facts, not theories. If you want your claims to be taken seriously, I suggest you bring forward concrete evidence." Cassie nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I will, Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering. "I just need time to connect the dots." Judge Grant gave her a long, scrutinizing look before turning her attention back to the courtroom. "This session is adjourned for the day," she announced. "We'll reconvene tomorrow. And Miss Blake, I trust you'll have something substantial to show for all this disruption." The gavel struck the desk, and the courtroom began to empty once again. As Cassie gathered her things, Marcus clapped a hand on her shoulder. "You're playing with fire," he said, though there was a hint of admiration in his voice. "But you might just be crazy enough to pull this off." Cassie smiled faintly, her mind already racing with possibilities. "I'm not just pulling this off," she said. "I'm going to blow this case wide open." That evening, Cassie sat at her desk, poring over every piece of evidence she had. She replayed the surveillance footage again, freezing on the same frame she had studied before. The shadows, the timestamp, the smudged wrench, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Someone powerful was orchestrating this from behind the scenes. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Marcus. "Be careful, kid, they're not going to like what you're digging up." Cassie stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Good. That means I'm on the right track." The morning came with a gray, overcast sky that mirrored the tension Cassie felt as she entered the courthouse. She gripped her notebook tightly, her mind focused on the plan she had spent the entire night refining. Today, she was going to connect the dots and show everyone that Daniel Carter wasn't just innocent. He had been deliberately framed. Marcus met her just outside the courtroom, a steaming coffee in one hand and a wary expression on his face. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, handing her the coffee. "I didn't," Cassie replied, taking a sip and wincing at the bitter taste. "Too much to do. Not enough time." Marcus glanced around the hallway, lowering his voice. "I heard through an old contact that someone high up might be connected to this case. You need to tread carefully, Cassie. If you push too hard—" "I don't have time to be careful, Marcus," she interrupted. "If we don't act now, they'll bury everything before we can expose it." Marcus sighed heavily. "You've got guts, kid, I'll give you that. Just don't let your guts get you into trouble you can't get out of." They entered the courtroom together, where the tension was palpable. The prosecutor was already seated, their demeanor sharp and guarded. Judge Grant sat at the bench, her expression unreadable, but her sharp eyes tracking every movement in the room. Cassie felt a faint chill run down her spine as she realized the judge wasn't just observing the trial. She was observing her. As the trial resumed, the prosecutor called their next witness, a forensic technician who had analyzed the wrench. The technician's testimony was concise and damning, confirming that Daniel's fingerprints were the only ones found on the weapon. Cassie's hand shot up, signaling to the defense attorney. He hesitated, then rose to his feet. "Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to have my consultant address the witness." Judge Grant's gaze flicked to Cassie, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Miss Blake," she said, her tone laced with warning, "this is highly unusual, but I'll allow it for now. Proceed carefully." Cassie stood, her legs feeling like jelly as she approached the stand. The technician watched her with a mixture of boredom and disdain, clearly unimpressed by her age. "You said Daniel Carter's fingerprints were the only ones on the wrench," Cassie began, her voice steady. "Did you test the wrench for any other substances, like cleaning chemicals?" The technician frowned. "That's not standard procedure unless requested. Were you aware," Cassie continued, "that traces of a cleaning solution were discovered on the wrench under UV light?" The technician shifted uncomfortably. "Number that wasn't brought to my attention." Cassie nodded, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, this proves the weapon was tampered with before being submitted as evidence. If Daniel's fingerprints were placed there after it was wiped down, it means someone deliberately framed him." The prosecutor jumped to their feet. "Objection. This is speculative at best." Judge Grant raised a hand. "Overruled. Continue, Miss Blake." Cassie turned back to the technician. "Is it possible that the wrench was wiped clean and then only Daniel's fingerprints were added afterward?" The technician hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "It's possible, yes." Another ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Cassie felt a spark of triumph but forced herself to stay composed. "Thank you," she said, stepping back to her seat. As the trial recessed for lunch, Cassie and Marcus huddled together in the courthouse cafeteria. "You've shaken them," Marcus said, watching the prosecutor pace furiously on the other side of the room. "But they're not going down without a fight." Cassie nodded, her appetite non-existent. "They're still holding something back. I can feel it." Her phone buzzed on the table. It was an email notification from the courthouse clerk. She opened it, her eyes widening as she read the attached document. "What is it?" Marcus asked, leaning closer. "They traced the chain of custody on the surveillance footage," Cassie said, her voice low. "The footage came from a private security firm, one contracted by Evermark Industries." Marcus frowned. "Evermark? The victim worked there, didn't he?" Cassie nodded, her mind racing. He was a whistleblower. If Evermark tampered with the footage, they're not just trying to frame Daniel. They're covering up whatever the victim was about to expose. Marcus rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "We're talking about a billion-dollar corporation, Cassie. If they're involved, this is bigger than you or me, bigger than this courtroom." Cassie's resolve only hardened. "Then we have to expose them before it's too late." When court reconvened, Cassie wasted no time bringing the new information to light. "Your Honor," she said, standing confidently, "I've just received documentation showing that the surveillance footage in question was provided by Evermark Industries, the company where the victim was employed." Judge Grant's eyes narrowed. "And your point, Miss Blake?" "My point is," Cassie said, her voice rising slightly, "Evermark had both the motive and the means to alter the footage. The victim was a whistleblower, and if his death is tied to what he was about to expose, Evermark would want to shift the blame onto someone else." The courtroom erupted in whispers, and the judge banged her gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" The prosecutor was visibly shaken, but they stood and attempted to counter. "Your Honor, this is pure conjecture. There is no direct evidence tying Evermark to any wrongdoing." Cassie turned to face the prosecutor, her voice firm. "Not yet, but if we subpoena Evermark's internal communications and security logs, I guarantee we'll find the proof." Judge Grant tapped her gavel lightly, her expression thoughtful but stern. "Miss Blake, you're asking this court to go down a very precarious road. But given the evidence you've presented thus far, I'm inclined to agree that this avenue warrants investigation." The prosecutors slammed their papers onto the table in frustration, but they didn't dare object further. The judge's decision was final. Cassie sat back in her seat, her heart pounding. She had just poked the hornet's nest, and now all she could do was wait for the fallout. But one thing was certain. She was getting closer to the truth, and whoever was behind this was starting to feel the heat. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically after Judge Grant approved the subpoena for Evermark Industries' internal communications and security logs. The prosecutor's confident veneer had cracked, and Cassie could sense the growing unease radiating from their side of the room. Even Judge Grant seemed unusually pensive, as though considering the far-reaching implications of Cassie's accusations. Cassie's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew the stakes had risen, and any misstep could unravel everything. When the judge adjourned court for the day, Cassie and Marcus stepped outside, where the gray sky had darkened further, threatening rain. Marcus walked silently beside her for a while, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and tense. "You realize what you've just done, don't you?" he said, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. "You've put a target on yourself. If Evermark is involved, and I think we both know they are, they won't take this lying down." Cassie stopped and turned to face him. "They've already tried to bury the truth. If they wanted to scare me off, they've had plenty of chances, but they haven't." "Why?" Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing as he thought. "Because they underestimated you," he said finally. "But now you're on their radar, and that changes everything." Cassie didn't flinch. "Good. If they're watching me, they'll slip up eventually." Marcus shook his head, muttering something under his breath about stubborn teenagers, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he sighed and gestured toward the courthouse parking lot. "Come on, I'll drive you home. You've done enough for one day." Later that night, Cassie sat in her room, surrounded by her notes and the growing mountain of evidence. She had spread everything out across her desk, pinning key documents and photos to the corkboard above it. Strings of red yarn connected various pieces, forming a tangled web that hinted at a much larger conspiracy. She stared at the subpoena order for Evermark's internal logs, wondering what secrets it might reveal. Evermark was a massive corporation with deep pockets and a reputation for crushing anyone who stood in its way. Cassie knew that if the subpoena uncovered even a fraction of what she suspected, the trial would become far bigger than Daniel Carter or the murder itself. It would become a battle against a corporation willing to do anything to protect its secrets. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was a text from Marcus. "Be careful tonight, I'll swing by in the morning." Cassie smiled faintly at his concern and replied, "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere." But as she set her phone down, her smile faded. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was closing in. The next morning, Marcus arrived as promised, his battered sedan idling in Cassie's driveway. She hopped in, her notebook tucked under her arm, and immediately noticed his grim expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, her pulse quickening. Marcus handed her a folded newspaper without saying a word. Cassie unfolded it and felt her stomach drop. The headline read, "Key witness in high-profile murder trial found dead." Her mind raced as she scanned the article. The witness was none other than Mr. Adams, the man whose testimony she had poked holes in the day before. The article claimed he had died in a car accident late the previous night, but Cassie wasn't convinced. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed to be a coincidence. "This wasn't an accident," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They silenced him." Marcus nodded grimly. "That's what I was afraid of. Whoever's behind this isn't just playing defense anymore. They're cleaning up loose ends. You've got to be careful, Cassie." Cassie clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She didn't know Mr. Adams personally, but his death felt like a warning, a message meant for her. "They're desperate," she said. "If they're willing to kill to keep this quiet, then we're closer to the truth than they want us to be." Marcus glanced at her, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. "You sure you still want to do this? You could walk away right now. No one would blame you." Cassie shook her head firmly. "If I walk away, they win. and Daniel pays the price for something he didn't do. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was even tenser than before. The judge entered, her expression unusually grave, and the murmurs in the room quieted instantly. The prosecutor appeared rattled, their usual confidence replaced by a stiff, guarded demeanor. Cassie noticed them glancing at their phone repeatedly, as if waiting for some critical piece of information. Judge Grant called the court to order and addressed the room. "Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge the tragic death of a witness in this case, Mr. Adams. While his loss is regrettable, this court will continue to pursue the truth no matter the obstacles." Her gaze shifted to Cassie, lingering for a moment longer than usual. It was as though the judge were silently acknowledging the undercurrent of danger that had entered the trial. Cassie sat straighter, meeting the judge's gaze with quiet determination. The day's proceedings moved slowly at first, with the defense and prosecution exchanging arguments over procedural matters. But everything changed when the court clerk entered, carrying a folder marked with Evermark's logo. The clerk handed the documents to the judge, who began reviewing them in silence. Cassie's heart pounded as she watched the judge's expression darken. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Judge Grant finally spoke. "These documents," the judge said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "contain evidence of systematic tampering with surveillance footage by Evermark Industries. This court has no choice but to widen the scope of this investigation to include possible corporate malfeasance." The courtroom erupted in chaos. The prosecutor jumped to their feet, sputtering objections, while the defense attorney looked stunned but quietly triumphant. Cassie sat frozen, her mind spinning. This was it, the breakthrough she had been waiting for. But as the noise swirled around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only just beginning. The courtroom felt like it was on the brink of collapse, the walls reverberating with angry murmurs and tense exchanges. Judge Grant's gavel slammed against her desk repeatedly, calling for order. But the energy in the room refused to settle. Cassie sat still in her seat, her notebook clenched tightly in her lap. Her plan had worked. Evermark was now at the center of the trial, but it didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. Judge Grant's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Enough," she snapped, her tone firm and unyielding. "This court will not devolve into chaos. The documents from Evermark Industries will be entered into evidence, and I am ordering an immediate recess while the court reviews their contents. When we return, both parties should be prepared to address the implications." Cassie exhaled slowly as the courtroom began to empty, though the tension lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Marcus leaned toward her, his voice low and cautious. "You've backed them into a corner," he said. "That's when people get dangerous." Cassie nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "That's why we need to move quickly," she replied. "If Evermark knows we've got their documents, they'll try to spin this before we can expose them." They walked out of the courtroom and into the hall, where reporters had gathered like vultures, eager for scraps of information. Cameras flashed and questions were shouted in every direction, but Cassie kept her head down, avoiding the chaos as she and Marcus pushed through the crowd. The whispers of teen detective and corporate conspiracy reached her ears, but she ignored them. She wasn't here for fame, she was here for the truth. The recess gave Cassie just enough time to delve into the documents Judge Grant had referenced. She sat in a quiet corner of the courthouse, Marcus by her side, as she sifted through pages of emails, memos, and internal reports. The deeper she dug, the clearer the picture became. Evermark had been covering up illegal activity for months. The victim, a junior accountant named Peter Hawkins, had uncovered discrepancies in financial records that pointed to embezzlement and fraud. He had reported his findings to a supervisor, but instead of taking action, Evermark had labeled him a liability. Cassie's fingers trembled as she held an email marked "Urgent" from the head of Evermark's security division. It was addressed to a private investigator, instructing them to take care of the Hawkins problem before it escalates. The chilling phrasing left no doubt in Cassie's mind. Hawkins's death hadn't been random. It was a hit. "This is it," she whispered, passing the email to Marcus. "This proves it wasn't Daniel. They killed Hawkins to protect their secret." Marcus scanned the email, his jaw tightening. "This is enough to turn the trial upside down," he said. "But you're still missing one thing." Cassie frowned. "What?" "Proof of who ordered it," Marcus replied grimly. "This email connects the dots, but without a name at the top of the chain, Evermark can claim it was a rogue employee acting alone." Cassie sat back, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He was right. The email was damning, but without identifying the person orchestrating the cover-up, it wasn't enough to bring Evermark down. When court resumed, the atmosphere was electric. The judge returned to her seat with a stack of Evermark's documents, her expression unreadable. The prosecutor, looking visibly rattled, stood to address the court. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, their voice tight with controlled anger. "While these documents raise serious questions about Evermark's practices, they do not exonerate the defendant. Daniel Carter's fingerprints were still found on the murder weapon, and the timeline places him at the scene of the crime." Cassie rose to her feet before the defense attorney could stop her. "Your Honor, may I speak?" she asked, her voice steady. Judge Grant raised an eyebrow. "Miss Blake, I hope this is worth it." "It is," Cassie said. She stepped forward, holding up the email she had found. This email, taken from Evermark's internal communications, proves that Peter Hawkins was targeted. He wasn't just a random victim. He was silenced because he discovered their crimes. And if we can trace who authorized this email, we'll find the real killer. The judge leaned forward, studying the email in Cassie's hand. "And do you have any evidence tying this email to a specific individual?" "Not yet," Cassie admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. "But if the court grants access to Evermark's full communication logs, we can trace the chain of command and uncover the person responsible." The prosecutor immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is a fishing expedition. There's no guarantee these logs will yield anything relevant to this trial." Judge Grant considered the objection, her face unreadable. After a long pause, she turned to Cassie. "Miss Blake, you're asking for an extraordinary level of access. If I grant this request, it will delay the trial significantly. Are you certain this is the right course of action?" Cassie nodded without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor. If we don't pursue this, we risk convicting an innocent man and letting a murderer walk free." The judge regarded her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well. The court will issue an order for Evermark Industries to provide their full communication logs as they pertain to this case. This trial will adjourn until those records are delivered." The prosecutor sat down heavily, their face a mask of frustration. Cassie returned to her seat, her heart racing. She had won another battle, but the war was far from over. As the courtroom emptied once again, Marcus pulled Cassie aside. "You just opened Pandora's box," he said. "If Evermark has nothing to hide, they'll cooperate, but if they do, they'll fight tooth and nail to stop us," Cassie finished, "which means we're finally getting close." Marcus gave her a long, hard look. "Close is dangerous," he said. "Watch your back." Cassie nodded, but deep down she already knew there was no turning back now. Cassie spent the next 2 days waiting anxiously for the communication logs from Evermark Industries. The court's subpoena had sent shockwaves through the company, and rumors swirled about legal teams scrambling to prepare their response. Marcus warned her repeatedly that Evermark might find ways to delay or obstruct the order, but Cassie remained steadfast. If they were stalling, it only meant they had something to hide. When the documents finally arrived, they came in the form of a massive digital archive, a labyrinth of emails, memos, and internal messages spanning months. Cassie, Marcus, and the defense attorney pored over them late into the night, sifting through thousands of pages of dry corporate jargon and coded language. It was tedious, grueling work, but Cassie refused to stop. "This is ridiculous," the defense attorney muttered, rubbing his temples as he scrolled through another thread of inconsequential emails. "They've buried whatever we're looking for under mountains of irrelevant junk." Cassie ignored him, her eyes scanning the screen with laser focus. Then, suddenly, she froze. Her heart skipped a beat as she leaned closer to the monitor. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp. "Go back." That message. Marcus leaned over her shoulder as she opened an email with the subject line, "Re. Hawkins issue. Final action required." It was brief, but chilling in its directness. "Ensure there are no loose ends. Failure is not an option. The board expects results immediately." The email was signed with only an initial. R. Cassie stared at the screen, her mind racing. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and dread. "This is the order to have Hawkins silenced." Marcus nodded grimly. "But who's R? Without a name, we're still stuck." Cassie bit her lip, thinking hard. Then it hit her. "We need to cross-reference this email with the recipient list. If we can figure out who received it and work backward, we might be able to trace it to the sender." Marcus gave her a wary look. "You're talking about digging through even more documents. You sure we've got time for that?" Cassie met his gaze, her determination unwavering. "If we don't, we're handing them a way out." The next day in court, the tension was palpable. The defense attorney stood to present the findings from the Evermark documents, highlighting the email Cassie had discovered. As the contents were read aloud, a ripple of shock spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor looked visibly rattled, their polished demeanor cracking under the weight of the evidence. Judge Grant leaned forward, her expression severe. "The court recognizes the significance of this email," she said. "However, the identity of the sender remains unclear. Without that information, we cannot draw definitive conclusions about Evermark's involvement in Mr. Hawkins' death." Cassie rose from her seat, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "we're working to identify the sender. But the fact that this message exists proves there was a coordinated effort to silence Hawkins. We can't ignore that." The judge regarded her carefully. "Miss Blake, you've proven to be thorough," she said, "but this court cannot act on speculation alone. You have until the end of this trial to provide concrete evidence of who authored this email. Otherwise, it will remain inadmissible." Cassie nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Understood, Your Honor." Back in the courthouse hallway, Cassie and Marcus regrouped. "We're running out of time," Marcus said, his voice low. "If we don't nail this down soon, they'll find a way to sweep it under the rug." Cassie paced back and forth, her mind working overtime. "There's got to be something," she muttered. "No one at Evermark would sign something like this without some kind of trace. A name, a signature, even a reference to a meeting." Marcus hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "I might know someone who can help," he said. "An old contact from my days on the force, worked cyber crimes. If anyone can pull a name out of that email header, it's him." Cassie stopped pacing, hope flickering in her eyes. "Can he do it in time?" Marcus shrugged. "If he can, it won't be cheap or legal." Cassie hesitated, weighing her options. Then she nodded. "Do it." That night, Marcus's contact delivered. The email's metadata had been stripped of most identifiers, but one critical piece of information remained: the sender's IP address, which was traced to a high-level executive at Evermark Industries. The name attached to it sent a chill down Cassie's spine. Richard Ellison, CEO. Cassie stared at the screen, the enormity of the revelation washing over her. "The CEO," she whispered. "He gave the order." Marcus crossed his arms, his expression grim. "It's the smoking gun we needed," he said. "But getting this in front of the court is going to be a battle." Cassie's resolve hardened. "Then we'll fight," she said. "We've come too far to stop now." The following morning, Cassie entered the courtroom with the evidence in hand. The defense attorney presented the findings, laying out the chain of emails that led directly to Richard Ellison. As the CEO's name was read aloud, the courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. The prosecutor stood, visibly flustered. "Your Honor, this is an unprecedented accusation. Richard Ellison is a respected business leader. To suggest he orchestrated a murder—" Judge Grant cut them off, her gavel striking sharply. "Respected or not, no one is above the law. This court will issue a summons for Mr. Ellison to appear and explain his involvement. Cassie felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. She had uncovered the truth, but now she had to ensure it saw the light of day. The courtroom buzzed with an air of anticipation the following day, as people packed into the gallery to witness what was quickly becoming a sensational case. Richard Ellison, CEO of Evermark Industries, arrived under heavy security, his expression calm but guarded. Dressed in an impeccable suit, he looked more like a man attending a high-stakes business meeting than someone accused of orchestrating murder. Cassie watched him carefully from her seat, her notebook resting on her lap. His body language told her everything she needed to know. This was a man used to control, but there was a faint tension in the set of his jaw. He wasn't invincible, and he knew it. Judge Grant called the court to order, her gavel striking sharply as the murmurs in the room subsided. "Mr. Ellison," she began, her tone as icy as ever, "you've been summoned here to address the evidence linking you to an email ordering the silencing of Peter Hawkins. I advise you to choose your words carefully." Ellison stood, his polished demeanor unshaken. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the accusation against me is both baseless and defamatory. I have no knowledge of any such email, nor would I ever condone such an act." Cassie narrowed her eyes, scribbling notes furiously as Ellison spoke. The calmness of his tone, the careful phrasing, it was all part of his strategy. He wasn't just defending himself. He was trying to dismantle the very idea of his involvement. The defense attorney rose, holding up the subpoenaed email chain. "Mr. Ellison," he began, "this email sent from your corporate account directly orders the silencing of Mr. Hawkins. Are you suggesting someone used your account without your knowledge?" Ellison didn't blink. "Evermark is a large organization," he said. "It's entirely possible that someone on my team sent that email without my authorization. I can't personally monitor every communication that goes through the company." Cassie's grip on her pen tightened. It was a plausible excuse, one designed to deflect responsibility while keeping his hands clean. But she wasn't about to let him off that easily. The defense attorney pressed on. "And yet," he said, "the email was traced to your personal device. Are you claiming someone had access to that as well?" Ellison hesitated, the first crack in his polished armor. "I'm saying that without further context, it's impossible to determine who sent that email," he replied carefully. Cassie leaned over to Marcus, whispering urgently, "He's playing for time. We need to expose the motive." Marcus nodded grimly. "You've got one shot, kid. Make it count." When the defense attorney paused, Cassie stood, her heart pounding. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, "may I address Mr. Ellison directly?" Judge Grant considered her for a long moment before nodding. "Proceed." Cassie stepped forward, her notebook in hand. She locked eyes with Ellison, refusing to be intimidated by the sheer force of his presence. "Mr. Ellison," she began, "Peter Hawkins discovered financial discrepancies in your company, embezzlement, fraud, and illegal activity that could have brought Evermark down. Isn't it true that his death conveniently silenced a whistleblower who posed a direct threat to your empire?" Ellison's calm facade wavered ever so slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice colder now. "Any accusations of wrongdoing are baseless." Cassie pressed on. "The email you claim to know nothing about specifically uses the phrase, 'no loose ends.' That's not corporate jargon. It's a death sentence. And if you didn't send it, then who else would have the authority to issue such an order?" Ellison's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Cassie opened her notebook, flipping to a page filled with her carefully organized findings. The financial discrepancies Hawkins uncovered directly implicated several board members, all of whom report to you. If that information had gone public, it would have cost you millions. And your position as CEO of the courtroom was deathly silent. Ellison's attorneys shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that their client was being cornered. Judge Grant interjected, her sharp gaze fixed on Ellison. "Mr. Ellison, you're under oath. Do you deny that these financial discrepancies existed?" Ellison hesitated, a bead of sweat forming on his temple. I'm not familiar with the specifics of Mr. Hawkins's work, he said carefully. But any financial issues would have been handled through the proper channels. Cassie didn't relent. Except they weren't, she said. Instead, you had Hawkins killed to protect yourself, and then you framed Daniel Carter, an easy scapegoat to tie up the loose ends. Ellison's composure cracked. That's ridiculous, he snapped, his voice rising. I had no reason to harm Hawkins. He was just an accountant. Judge Grant raised her hand, silencing the outburst. Miss Blake, she said, her tone measured, you've made a compelling case, but do you have definitive proof that Mr. Ellison ordered Hawkins's murder? Cassie hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't have a smoking gun, not yet. But then a memory surfaced, one that sent her flipping through her notes. She stopped on a page containing a transcript of an old Evermark board meeting, one she had nearly dismissed as irrelevant. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, I have one more piece of evidence. In a board meeting 6 months ago, Mr. Ellison made a statement about protecting the company at all costs. He said, and I quote, "If anyone threatens our future, we'll deal with them swiftly." That meeting occurred just weeks before Hawkins uncovered the discrepancies. Judge Grant raised an eyebrow. Her interest clearly piqued. Do you have documentation of this statement? Cassie nodded, holding up the transcript. Yes, Your Honor. It's all here. The judge took the transcript and read it silently, her expression growing colder by the second. Finally, she looked up, her gaze fixed on Ellison. Mr. Ellison, this court finds your explanations insufficient. I'm ordering a full investigation into your actions and the actions of Evermark Industries. Until then, you are not to leave the state. Ellison's face darkened, but he said nothing as the judge banged her gavel, signaling the end of the day's session. Cassie sat back in her seat, her body trembling with adrenaline. She had done it. She had put Richard Ellison on the defensive. But as the courtroom emptied, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. Powerful men like Ellison didn't go down without a fight, and she had just declared war. The courtroom had cleared out, leaving behind only echoes of the day's chaos and tension. Cassie sat at the defense table, staring at her notebook but seeing nothing. Her mind raced as she replayed every moment of the trial. She had forced Richard Ellison into a corner, but she also knew she had provoked a dangerous man. Marcus approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. You good? He asked quietly, his voice gentler than usual. Cassie nodded but didn't look up. For now, she murmured. But he's not going to sit back and wait for the investigation. Men like Ellison don't fight fair. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat beside her. You're right, he said. But that's why we have to stay a step ahead. What's next? Cassie finally looked at him, her eyes sharp and determined. We need to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Ellison orchestrated everything, the tampered evidence, the emails, the framing of Daniel. If we don't, he'll use his money and power to wriggle out of this. Later that night, Cassie sat in her dimly lit bedroom, surrounded by the organized chaos of her case notes. On the wall in front of her, she had pinned photos, emails, and documents, all connected by strings of red and blue yarn. The web of evidence pointed directly at Ellison, but there were still gaps, holes in the timeline that left room for doubt. Her phone buzzed on the desk, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Marcus. Meet me at the diner. Found something big. Cassie grabbed her notebook and coat, adrenaline surging as she hurried out the door. The diner was nearly empty when she arrived, the neon sign outside casting a flickering glow through the windows. Marcus was waiting in a corner booth, a stack of papers spread out in front of him. He looked up as she slid into the seat across from him. What is it? She asked, her voice tinged with urgency. Marcus tapped one of the papers. I pulled Hawkins's phone records, he said. His last call was to a burner phone. The same number pops up in Ellison's call logs 3 days before Hawkins's death. Cassie's eyes widened. A direct link. Marcus nodded. It gets better. The burner phone was purchased using a credit card tied to an alias Ellison's used before. This isn't just circumstantial, Cassie. This is concrete. Cassie's heart pounded as she processed the information. This proves Ellison coordinated the hit, she said. It's the missing piece we needed. Marcus leaned back, a grim smile on his face. It's enough to bury him if the judge accepts it. The next day, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras and microphones trained on the defense table, where Cassie and the legal team sat. The buzz in the room was palpable. Everyone knew this was the day the trial would take its most dramatic turn. Judge Grant entered, her gavel silencing the murmurs almost instantly. "Let's proceed," she said, her tone clipped. "The defense has requested to submit new evidence. You may present it now." The defense attorney stood, but instead of addressing the court, he gestured to Cassie. "Your Honor, our consultant, Miss Blake, will explain the findings." Cassie stood, her legs trembling slightly as she approached the front of the courtroom. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a reassuring nod, and then turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "we have obtained phone records that establish a direct connection between Richard Ellison and the events surrounding Peter Hawkins' death. These records show that Hawkins' last call was to a burner phone, which was also used to communicate with Mr. Ellison days before the crime." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Furthermore, the burner phone was purchased using a credit card tied to an alias known to be used by Mr. Ellison. This evidence directly implicates him in coordinating the hit on Hawkins. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Grant's usually stoic expression shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing as she processed the new information. The prosecutor rose, visibly shaken. "Your Honor, this evidence is unexpected. We need time to verify its validity." Judge Grant's gaze snapped to the prosecutor. "You've had plenty of time to prepare your case," she said sharply. "This court will review the evidence immediately." During the recess, Cassie sat in the hallway with Marcus, her mind buzzing with nervous energy. "Do you think it'll hold up?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "It's airtight. Ellison can try to deny it, but the paper trail doesn't lie." As they spoke, Cassie noticed a man in a suit lingering near the corner of the hallway, his gaze fixed on her. He looked away when their eyes met, but Cassie's stomach twisted with unease. "We're being watched," she muttered. Marcus followed her gaze and frowned. "Let's stick together. If Ellison's desperate enough, he might try to intimidate us." When court resumed, Judge Grant reviewed the phone records and evidence with meticulous care. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as the seconds ticked by. Finally, she looked up, her expression grave. "This court finds the evidence submitted by the defense to be credible and highly relevant to this case," she said. "Mr. Ellison, you are hereby ordered to remain in custody pending further investigation into your involvement in the murder of Peter Hawkins." The courtroom erupted in chaos as reporters shouted questions, and Ellison's attorneys scrambled to confer with their client. Cassie sat back in her seat, a wave of relief washing over her. They had done it. They had finally cornered him. But as the gavel struck and the session ended, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. Ellison wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly, and she knew he still had cards left to play. The courthouse steps were a frenzy of reporters, microphones, and flashing cameras as Cassie and Marcus exited the building. The media swarm descended instantly, shouting questions and jostling for a soundbite. Cassie's name was on every reporter's lips. Teen detective, whistleblower, hero, but the attention only made her stomach churn. Marcus placed a steadying hand on her shoulder and guided her through the chaos. "No comments," he growled at the crowd, shielding Cassie as they made their way to his car. "Let's go, kid. This circus isn't where we need to be right now." They drove in tense silence, the noise of the courthouse fading into the background. Cassie stared out the window, her thoughts swirling with everything that had happened. Ellison was in custody, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business. Men like Ellison didn't just fold under pressure, they retaliated. "You did good today," Marcus said, breaking the silence. His voice was gruff, but genuine. It's not easy taking down someone like Ellison. Most people wouldn't even try. Cassie turned to him, her expression serious. You think it's over? Marcus sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. Not by a long shot. Ellison's got resources, connections. He's not going to sit in a cell and wait for the truth to bury him. He'll fight back, and he'll fight dirty. Cassie nodded. She already knew this. She could feel it in her gut. That night, Cassie sat at her desk, reviewing her notes for the 100th time. The chain of evidence felt solid, but something still gnawed at her. There was a missing piece, something she hadn't connected yet. The phrase from Ellison's email echoed in her mind. No loose ends. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus. Stay alert. Heard Ellison's team is already filing motions to suppress the evidence. They're going to come after you. Cassie frowned, her heartbeat quickening. She typed back, let them, they can't erase the truth. But even as she sent the message, a flicker of doubt crept in. She wasn't just up against Ellison. She was up against the entire system he controlled. The next morning, Cassie arrived at the courthouse early, her nerves on edge. The day's proceedings were focused on pre-trial motions. And as expected, Ellison's legal team came out swinging. They argued that the phone records were inadmissible, that the email was forged, that the subpoenaed evidence violated corporate privacy laws. Every argument was designed to poke holes in the case and create just enough doubt to tip the scales in Ellison's favor. Cassie watched from her seat, her fists clenched. It was maddening to see how easily money and influence could twist the truth. But as the defense attorney droned on, an idea began to form in her mind. Ellison's team was fighting so hard to discredit the evidence because they knew it was real. They were scared, and that fear could be used against them. During a recess, Cassie pulled Marcus aside. We need to find someone inside Evermark, she said urgently. Someone who knows what really happened and isn't afraid to talk. Marcus frowned. You're talking about a whistleblower. You really think anyone's going to stick their neck out now? Ellison's people will bury them. They won't have to, Cassie said, her voice firm. If we can get them to testify under oath, the truth will protect them. And if they're already part of the cover-up, it might be their only way out. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, clearly conflicted. You're playing with fire, kid. I know, Cassie said, but it's the only way to end this. That evening, Cassie and Marcus began reaching out to former Evermark employees, using every contact and lead they could find. Most of the calls ended in silence or abrupt hang-ups, but one name kept coming up. Beth Harper. She had worked in Evermark's accounting department alongside Peter Hawkins and had left the company shortly after his death. Cassie managed to track down a number and left a message, her voice carefully measured. Ms. Harper, my name is Cassie Blake. I'm investigating the death of Peter Hawkins. I think you know why he was targeted, and I think you want the truth to come out. Please call me back. You don't have to do this alone. She hung up and stared at her phone, willing it to ring. Hours passed with no response, and Cassie began to lose hope. But just as she was about to give up, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Meet me at the park on 8th Street. Midnight. Come alone. Cassie's heart raced as she read the message. It was risky, too risky. But she knew she couldn't ignore it. The park was deserted when Cassie arrived, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty benches and pathways. She clutched her notebook tightly, her breath visible in the cool night air. A figure emerged from the darkness, a woman in her late 30s with tired eyes and a wary expression. It had to be Beth Harper. You're the girl stirring up all this trouble? Beth said, her voice low and sharp. Do you have any idea what you're up against? Cassie stepped closer, her voice steady. I know exactly what I'm up against. That's why I need your help. Beth crossed her arms, her eyes scanning the park as though expecting to be watched. You're poking a bear, kid. Ellison doesn't just ruin people, he destroys them. Cassie didn't flinch. Peter Hawkins was trying to do the right thing. He was murdered for it. Don't let him die for nothing. Beth hesitated, her expression softening. Finally, she sighed. Fine, I'll tell you what I know. But if this backfires, you're on your own. Cassie nodded, her heart pounding. That's all I need. Beth Harper's hands trembled as she sat on the cold metal bench in the park, her voice barely above a whisper. Cassie sat beside her, notebook open and pen poised, her full attention locked on the woman who might hold the key to everything. It started about a year ago, Beth began, her eyes darting around the empty park. Peter discovered irregularities in the company's financial reports, millions of dollars funneled into offshore accounts, coded as operational expenses. He brought it up to our supervisor, but they told him to drop it, said it was above his pay grade. She laughed bitterly. Peter wasn't the kind of guy to let things slide. He started digging deeper. Cassie scribbled furiously, her mind racing as Beth continued. A few weeks before he died, Peter came to me, Beth said, her voice cracking. He told me he had proof, bank statements, internal memos, even emails implicating Ellison directly. He was scared, but he thought if he brought it to the board, they'd have no choice but to act. But they didn't, Cassie said, finishing the thought. Beth shook her head. Number. Instead, Peter started getting threats, anonymous calls, messages warning him to stop. He was stubborn, though. He said he couldn't live with himself if he let it go. The day before he died, he told me he was meeting someone after work to hand over the evidence. He never told me who. Cassie leaned forward. What happened to the evidence? Beth hesitated, biting her lip. After Peter was killed, I went to his desk to see if I could find anything. His files were gone. His computer had been wiped. But I know he kept backups. He was paranoid. If anyone has them, it's the person he was meeting. Cassie's heart sank. It was a lead, but not enough. Do you have any idea who that person might be? Anyone he trusted? Beth hesitated again, her expression troubled. There was a private investigator he mentioned once, someone outside the company. He said they could help him if things went south. I don't know their name, but I remember him saying they used to be a cop. Cassie's mind immediately went to Marcus. Could it have been him? She glanced at Beth, her brow furrowing. Was it Marcus Reed? Beth's eyes widened in recognition. Yeah, that was the name. Cassie felt the ground shift beneath her. She stood abruptly, her thoughts a tangled mess. Thank you, she said, her voice tight. You've been a huge help. Beth reached out, grabbing her arm. Be careful, Cassie. Ellison's people will do whatever it takes to protect him. Don't make the same mistake Peter did. Cassie nodded and walked away, her chest tightening with each step. If Marcus had known Peter Hawkins, why hadn't he said anything? Had he been protecting her, or himself? The next morning, Cassie confronted Marcus at his office. He looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression unreadable. What's wrong? He asked. You knew Peter Hawkins, Cassie said bluntly, dropping her notebook on his desk. Why didn't you tell me? Marcus leaned back in his chair, a sigh escaping him. I figured it'd come out eventually, he said. Yeah, I knew him. He hired me to look into Ellison months before he was killed. But when he died, I backed off. I thought it was too dangerous. Cassie's hands curled into fists. You had evidence that could have stopped all of this. Why didn't you come forward? Marcus's gaze hardened. Because I didn't want to end up like Peter. I've seen what people like Ellison do to anyone who crosses them. I thought I could protect you by staying out of it. Cassie shook her head, anger and disappointment boiling over. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself. Peter trusted you and you let him down. Marcus stood, his expression stormy. You don't know what it's like to carry something like this, he said, his voice low. To watch people get hurt because you couldn't do enough. I made a choice and I have to live with it. Cassie took a step back, her voice cold. Well, now you have a chance to fix it. If Peter trusted you, then you're the one who can help me find his backups. Marcus's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. All right, he said. I'll help. But we need to move fast. If Ellison gets wind of this, we're out of time. That afternoon, Cassie and Marcus broke into Peter Hawkins's old storage unit, using a key Beth had provided. Inside, they found rows of neatly labeled boxes, each one filled with files, notebooks, and external hard drives. Cassie's heart raced as they dug through the contents, searching for the evidence that would finally bring Ellison down. "Here," Marcus said, pulling out a hard drive labeled Hawkins Backup 1. He connected it to his laptop, and Cassie held her breath as the files loaded. The screen filled with spreadsheets, emails, and scanned documents. Everything Peter had uncovered about Evermark's corruption. "This is it," Cassie whispered. "This is what he died for." Marcus nodded grimly. "We need to get this to the court immediately. If we hold on to it, we're sitting ducks." The final day of the trial was explosive. Cassie and Marcus presented the hard drive to Judge Grant, who reviewed its contents with a visible mix of shock and outrage. The evidence was undeniable: bank transfers, internal memos, and direct orders from Ellison himself. It was the nail in the coffin. As Ellison's legal team scrambled to respond, the judge made her ruling. This court finds sufficient evidence to charge Richard Ellison with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder. He will remain in custody until his trial. The gallery erupted into cheers, and reporters scrambled to cover the verdict. Cassie sat back in her seat, a wave of relief washing over her. It was over. They had won. But as Ellison was led away in handcuffs, he turned to Cassie, his expression dark and unyielding. "This isn't over," he said softly. "You've made a powerful enemy." Cassie met his gaze without flinching. "No," she replied. "You made an enemy of the truth, and the truth always wins." As the courtroom emptied, Marcus walked over and gave her a small, proud smile. "You did good, kid," he said. "Better than I ever could have." Cassie smiled back, but her mind was already racing ahead. The case was closed, but the fight for justice never really ended. She had proven herself as a detective, but she knew there were more battles to come, and she was ready for them.